Iris Marlowe walked straight into the empty circle. 100 people had just backed away from lifted both hands and signed a greeting to the mute man. Nobody dared stand within 10 feet of. The auction hall stopped breathing. Matteo Rusca turned, his gray eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time that night, the most feared man in Detroit looked surprised. She was being paid $200 to stay invisible. She had just made herself the most visible person in the room, and neither of them knew that a contract carrying her forged signature was already being carried toward the podium. If you're still here, subscribe and stay with this story all the way to the end. And comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled. $200. That was the number Iris Marlowe had turned over in her head for 6 days straight, ever since Reese Dunmore called her at 9 at night and asked whether she wanted an easy evening's work recording bids for a private sale. $200 was Micah's speech tablet repair. It was the electric bill she had been paying in halves. It was 1 week of not calculating grocery totals in her head before reaching the register. She had told herself she was not the kind of woman who could be bought for $200, and then she had said yes in under 4 seconds, and she had been quietly ashamed of that ever since. Dunmore gave her 3 rules in the quarter before he disappeared into the crowd. Keep her head down, record every number exactly as it was called, and under no circumstances attract the attention of Matteo Rusca. He said the 3rd rule twice. He said it the way men say things they have personally learned the hard way. Then he adjusted her tablet against her chest like she was a piece of equipment he had rented, told her the dress looked fine, and left her standing alone among people whose watches cost more than her sister's car. Iris was 29 years old. She restored stained glass for a living when there was work and cataloged other people's collections when there wasn't. She had spent 4 years learning how to read a leaded panel the way a doctor reads an x-ray, where a repair had been made, where a break had been hidden, where somebody had lied about a date. That skill had never once paid her rent on time. Tonight it was being rented out at $25 an hour to write down what rich men were willing to pay for church windows that had been cut out of buildings while the buildings were still standing. She had made her peace with that in the car. She unmade it about 40 minutes in. The first thing she noticed about the room was not the money, it was the choreography. When Matteo Rusca entered, nobody announced him and nobody had to. The crowd simply reorganized itself around him the way water reorganizes around a stone. Men who were visibly armed stepped out of his path. Women in diamonds turned their shoulders. A dealer who had been laughing loudly a second earlier found something urgent to examine on the far wall. Nobody greeted him. Nobody offered a hand, and Iris watched a man in a gray suit lean toward his companion and say something behind his fingers. She couldn't hear it, but she didn't need to. She knew that gesture. She had seen it in school hallways and waiting rooms and grocery aisles for 8 years. That was the moment the evening stopped being about $200. Her nephew Micah was 8 and did not speak. Iris had watched her teachers address her instead of him, while he sat 2 feet away, fully present, fully understanding, being talked over like furniture. She had watched a pediatric receptionist raise her voice at him as though volume were a translation. She had watched a grown man at a bus stop congratulate himself out loud for being patient with a child who had never asked him for patience. So she recognized what was happening in that hall, and she recognized that underneath the fear of Matteo Rusca, there was something dirtier and older. These people were not only afraid of him, they had quietly decided that because he could not speak, ordinary courtesy no longer applied. Fear was the excuse. Contempt was the product. She told herself to keep her head down. She was very good at keeping her head down. She had been doing it professionally for years. Then she watched him stand alone in a ring of empty marble, while 200 people pretended he was a weather condition, and something in her chest simply refused. She stepped into the circle. She raised her hands. She signed good evening and asked whether he needed anything. The room's noise dropped by half in under 2 seconds. She felt it happen against her skin, the way you feel a plane change altitude. Matteo turned his head. He looked at her for a long moment without moving anything else, and Iris had the strange, disorienting sense of being read rather than looked at, of standing in front of a man who was going through her line by line. Then his right hand came out of his coat pocket, and he answered. He asked with the fast, unhesitating precision of someone who had lived in the language for years, whether she actually knew sign or had memorized 4 sentences for a charity gala. She told him her nephew used it. She told him that everyone in this room was currently pretending he was invisible and that she found it embarrassing to watch. One corner of his mouth moved. He signed that she greeted dangerous men by insulting the room they were standing in. She signed back that she only insulted rooms that had earned it. His eyes went briefly to the tablet clamped against her chest, to the cheap black dress Dunmore had told her to wear, to the shoe where the strap had been restitched by hand. He did not look at her the way 3 other men had looked at her that night. He looked at her like a document nobody else in the building had bothered to open. She was still deciding what that meant when Dunmore's hand closed around her upper arm hard enough to bruise. He hissed her name. He asked what the hell she thought she was doing. He pulled and she pulled back, and for one humiliating second, she was a woman being physically moved across a floor by her employer in front of 200 witnesses, none of whom looked up. Mateo did not make a sound. He did not reach for the weapon under his coat. He lifted 2 fingers. The auctioneer stopped talking in the middle of a sentence about a 15th century reliquary. The gavel hovered. 200 people froze mid-conversation, and Iris understood in a cold rush exactly how much power was standing 4 feet away from her. Mateo pointed at Dunmore's hand. Dunmore let go so fast it looked like the arm had burned him. He laughed badly and said it was a misunderstanding that Miss Marlowe was temporary staff and had wandered somewhere she shouldn't. Mateo signed something to the broad, silver-haired man standing behind him. Iris caught only the name Gus. The man came forward, took the small black pad Mateo held out, and read the single line written on it aloud in a flat, bored voice. Mr. Ruska wished to know why temporary staff were being handled like property. Nobody laughed. Dunmore wiped his palm down his jacket and said she had made an error, and he had been correcting it. Mateo looked at Iris and asked her in sign whether she had made an error. She said she had said hello. The almost smile came back. He signed in that case Dunmore had corrected the wrong person and turned away, and the entire hall exhaled at once. Iris walked back to her position at the side wall with her heart slamming and her arms still stinging and a feeling she couldn't name climbing up the inside of her ribs. Dunmore followed her. He didn't touch her again. He told her very quietly that she had just cost him things she couldn't count, and that if she wanted to keep working in this city, she would record numbers and nothing else for the rest of the night. She should have listened. She would think about that a great deal later. Lot 17 came out under the lights 40 minutes on. A single Lancet panel salvaged catalogued as workshop of a famous 19th century studio provenance, claiming 80 unbroken years in one private collection. Iris stopped typing. She had been trained by a woman who used to say that glass never lies, only the paperwork does. And the paperwork on Lot 17 was lying. The outer lead didn't match the era it claimed. The profile was wrong, machine drawn, half a century too young for a panel that had supposedly sat untouched since before the war, which meant the panel had been releaded, which meant it had been out of its frame in somebody's hands at some point nobody wanted written down. And there was something else. Wedged into the old came where the new lead had been folded over it. There was a sliver of paper brown with age, with a fragment of printed type still visible. Somebody had packed that panel for transport using newspaper. In a period when this panel was supposed to have been sitting in a climate-controlled room in one house, never moving. She stepped closer without deciding to. She was 3 feet from the display before she remembered where she was and who she was and what she had been hired to do. Dunmore caught her eye across the room and shook his head. Once, slowly, she sat down and typed the opening bid. The panel climbed to 400,000. It climbed to 8. Paddles rose all over the room, and Iris recorded every number with hands that had started very slightly to shake because 2 thoughts had arrived at the same time, and neither of them was good. The first thought was that this panel had a false provenance. The second thought was that Rhys Dunmore had brought it here, which meant Rhys Dunmore either didn't know or he was the one who had written the lie. Mateo Ruska did not bid on Lot 17. Iris looked up twice, and both times he was not looking at the glass. He was looking at her. Dunmore came back to her side and leaned close enough that his breath moved her hair and told her to record the numbers and stop examining things she had not been hired to understand. She told him the lead was wrong. He said she had seen nothing. She said the cane was 50 years too young and there was newsprint in the fold and that any conservator in the country would spot it in 90 seconds. Dunmore straightened up. And for 1 second she would replay for the next 11 months, his face did something that had nothing to do with anger. It went slack. It went afraid. He said not another word and walked toward two men standing at the back wall in dark green ties. Iris knew the ties. Everyone who worked the edges of the art trade in that city knew the ties. This Draeger group financed acquisitions no legitimate bank would touch and collected on them through channels no court had ever approved of. One of them handed Dunmore a slim folder. Dunmore looked down at it, then looked across the room at Iris, then looked away very quickly. Her stomach dropped through the floor. Lot 17 closed at 1,400,000. The gavel came down. She typed the figure and got two digits wrong and had to fix them. Then the auctioneer said there would be a short pause before final settlements, and instead of dimming the lights, he picked up a second document. The room went quiet on its own. He announced that a private obligation had been attached to tonight's proceedings. He announced that Dunmore Salvage and Architectural had defaulted on a secured Draeger advance. He announced that the collateral schedule filed against that advance included the firm's certification assets. Iris did not understand for perhaps 4 seconds. Certification assets. She thought it meant equipment. Then the auctioneer read the schedule, and her own name was in it. He read it clearly the way you read a lot number. Iris Marlowe, licensed conservator, certificate holder, 41 authentication documents bearing her signature and license number held as security against the outstanding balance transferable to the creditor on default. She heard the number 41 before she understood the sentence. 41. She had signed 6 authentications in her entire career, all of them small, all of them honest, all of them under supervision. Somebody had used her name 35 more times. The floor tilted. The tablet slid in her hands and she caught it against her chest and held it there like it could stop what was happening. Every face in that room had turned toward her, and she could see them making the calculation one after another after another. The girl in the $200 dress, the girl with the repaired shoe, the girl who had wandered too close to Rosca, of course. Of course she was for sale. Of course she had signed. She turned to find Dunmore, and he was already looking at the floor. She said his name once, just his name. He said it had been standard staffing protection language, that the certificates were supposed to be internal, that the Draegers were never supposed to enforce anything. She asked him how many. He didn't answer. She asked him how many pieces had gone out of the country with her signature on them. He told her to keep her voice down. And that was the moment Iris Marlowe understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that she was going to prison. Not metaphorically, not eventually. Fraudulent authentication of cultural property. 41 counts: her license, her name, her handwriting reproduced well enough to satisfy men who had paid millions on the strength of it. There was no version of that story where a woman with no money and no lawyer walked away clean. The men in the green ties did not need to hurt her. They only needed to hold the folder, and every year of her life belonged to them. One of them took a step toward her. The silver cane struck the marble once. The sound was not loud. It carried anyway, and every head in the room turned toward it, and the man in the green tie stopped moving as if he had walked into glass. Matteo Rusca wrote 4 lines on his black pad and handed it to Gus. Gus read it aloud without inflection. Mr. Rusca offered $1,200,000 for the immediate and complete surrender of the Dunmore certification file, every original, every copy, every scan, every duplicate, every derivative claim, and every threat, obligation, service, condition, or future use attached to the name Iris Marlowe. A sound went through the crowd that Iris felt in her teeth. The lead Draeger man smiled and said the outstanding balance was $920,000 and asked what the rest was supposed to buy. Matteo wrote one more line and Gus read it. The remainder purchased their permanent loss of interest. Nobody in the room mistook the meaning. The auctioneer looked from the Draegers to Dunmore to Matteo and back again, and his hand was not steady when he lifted the gavel. He said $1,200,000 for full release of all obligations connected to Miss Marlowe. The gavel came down, settled. Cameras were forbidden inside that hall. It didn't matter. 200 people carried it out in their heads, and Iris knew, standing there with her tablet against her chest and her legs barely holding her, exactly what the story would be by morning. It would not be that a man had bought back a forgery to keep an innocent woman out of a courtroom. It would be simpler and uglier and much more entertaining. The $1 million assistant, the girl Ruska purchased at auction. She did not cry. She was proud of that later. She stood absolutely still and let 100 strangers redecorate her life while her employer stood 10 feet away and said nothing at all. Dunmore tried to come toward her once. Mateo stepped into the space between them without hurrying and simply held out his hand, palm up. Dunmore stared at it. Gus said one word to the file. Dunmore took the folder from inside his jacket and put it into Mateo's palm. Mateo turned and offered it to Iris. She opened it. She read 4 pages. Then she looked up and told him flatly that none of it was legally enforceable, that no court in this country would honor a schedule that pledged a person's professional identity as collateral. He signed that the paper had never been the danger, the men behind it were. She said that now every person in that room believed she belonged to him. His face changed, then hardened in a way that had nothing to do with her. He signed one word: no. Then he signed that it was what the room believed, not what was true, and that the difference was the only thing he intended to defend. He took out a card, wrote an address, then a time 8 in the morning, and beneath it, one more line, that she deserved the full explanation, and that she should come only if she chose to. He held it out. Iris did not take it. She asked him in sign why she should trust him. He answered that she should not yet. Her hands shook when she finally reached for the card, and she hated that, and she took it anyway. And as she walked out, past 200 people who were already telling each other what she was, Iris Marlowe was thinking about only one thing. Not the money, not the marble, not the man. 41 documents. Somebody had been signing her name for 2 years, and Reese Dunmore had known her rent to the dollar the entire time. She sat in her car in the parking structure for 40 minutes before she could drive, and she spent every one of them doing math instead of feeling anything because math was safer. 41 documents. 2 years. Reese Dunmore had known she took the bus in January to save on gas. He had known Micah's tablet was cracked. He had asked her once in a voice full of concern whether she had considered getting a second job, and she had thought at the time that he was being kind. He had been calculating how desperate she was and how quietly she would go down if the whole thing ever surfaced. Iris got home at 2 in the morning and told her sister Rhea everything, and Rhea listened without interrupting once, which was how Iris knew it was bad. When she finished, Rhea asked one question: whether the man who had spent $1.2 million had asked for anything in return. Iris said not yet. Rhea said that was the part that should scare her, and then she packed Micah's lunch for the morning and told her without turning around not to confuse being rescued with being owned, and not to let one expensive gesture erase the fact that he was still what he was. Iris went anyway. She was at the gate at 7:58. Gus met her at the door and looked in daylight less like an executioner and more like a tired man who had spent 30 years expecting trouble at every entrance he'd ever walked through. When she asked whether Ruska always sent someone else to speak for him, he told her only when people insisted that speech and communication were the same thing, and that answer rearranged something in her head before she'd even gotten inside. Mateo was waiting with a metal tray on the desk and the folder beside it. He gestured at the door. She left it open. He nodded once, accepted it without making it a statement, and that was the second thing that day that surprised her. She asked him what exactly he thought he had bought. He put the file in the tray and struck a match. She watched her own forged signature curl and go black. 41 documents, each one a year of her life, going up in a metal dish, while she stood there with her hands in fists. When the last page collapsed, he handed her a separate envelope, a notarized release signed by a Draeger representative by Dunmore by 2 attorneys. Every claim canceled, no condition anywhere in it requiring her to work for him, repay him, appear beside him, or remain under his protection. She read it twice looking for the hook. There wasn't one. She said he had paid $1.2 million to burn a piece of paper. He signed that he had paid $1.2 million to make dangerous men understand that the paper no longer gave them permission. She said he had made her look like merchandise in front of 200 people. He signed yes. The honesty stopped her cold. She had been braced for a speech. He signed that it had been the fastest way to stop them publicly, and that it had not been the kindest way to protect her dignity, and that he was sorry. Powerful men in Iris's experience apologized the way they negotiated, attaching a reason that quietly dissolved the apology on the way out. He didn't attach anything. He just left it there. She asked him why her. He reached for the pad, changed his mind, and used his hands instead. He signed that he had understood the clause the second it was read, that Dunmore had been too frightened to protect her, that he had spent his entire life watching people treat silence as permission, and that she had been the only person in that room who spoke to him like a human being before she knew what he could do for her. Iris thought about Micah in a pediatrician's waiting room being talked over by a woman holding his chart. She asked what happened now. He signed that she left, if that was what she wanted, that the Dragers would not touch her because they believed she was his. And when her jaw tightened, he added the rest that they believed harming her would make them his. The distinction should not have been comforting, it was. Then he opened a second folder, and the whole conversation changed shape. It was an employment offer, 30-day trial, communications, liaison records, specialist conservation consultant. The salary was 5 times what Dunmore had been paying her. It included independent legal counsel, her own attorney, not his health insurance for a dependent, and a clause guaranteeing she could resign at any hour without penalty or repayment. She looked up and said he couldn't have known she had conservation training. He pointed at her own auction notes on the desk. She had typed next to Lot 17 that the CAIM profile was inconsistent, that there was newsprint in the fold, and that the provenance required review. She hadn't given anyone those notes. Dunmore had never asked for them. She said he'd gone into her tablet. He signed that the tablet had been in the file the Dragers surrendered, along with everything else Dunmore had pledged, and that he had read 3 lines and stopped. Then he signed that he noticed everything people assumed silence prevented him from understanding. Iris put the contract down and told him her terms. She kept her own apartment. Her sister always knew where she was. Nobody bought anything for her family without asking her first. And Micah was never under any circumstances used to persuade her of anything. He agreed to all 4. His hand hesitated a half second on the last one, and she saw it, and she let him see that she'd seen it. Then he offered his hand not as a command, just waiting palm open for as long as it took. She put hers in it. Her first week taught her that silence made careless people confess things about themselves they didn't know they were saying. A shipping executive told her to inform Mr. Ruska that the revised figures were acceptable, while Mr. Ruska sat 18 inches away from him. Iris looked at Mateo, then back at the man, and told him the person he needed was sitting right there. The executive went red and said he'd assumed she was there to interpret. She told him she was there to interpret, not to pretend a man had disappeared. Mateo wrote his response and handed it to her, and she read it aloud with a straight face that the figures were not acceptable, and neither was being discussed like furniture. Afterward, he signed that she had enjoyed that a little. She signed that she had refused to help, which was different, and his shoulders shook in a laugh that made no sound at all. And Iris realized she was going to have a problem because his humor lived in his hands and reached his face about 2 seconds late, and she had started watching for the delay. She learned him fast after that. He drank coffee strong enough to strip paint. He skipped lunch whenever nobody was watching. He hid his headaches by pressing 2 fingers against the scar that ran from his right temple down toward his jaw. The scar he had gotten at 19 in an accident he never described in detail, and 2 emergency surgeries that saved his airway and took his voice permanently. She stopped asking about it after the first time his hand went still on the question. The shoes were the first real fight. She found the box on her desk on a Tuesday, black expensive, exactly her size. She carried it into his office unopened and set it down and said no. He looked from the box to her face and started writing an explanation, and she read it off his expression before the pen finished, that the repaired strap was hurting her, that she was on her feet 9 hours a day. She told him that noticing was fine. Quietly replacing things in her life was not. She told him that the second she let him fix a problem privately, it stopped being a job and became a debt, and she would rather limp. His jaw went tight. He wrote that they hurt her. She said then create a formal wardrobe allowance for every employee required to attend formal events and put it in writing and let everyone use it. He stared at her long enough that Gus glanced in from the hall to see whether he needed to intervene. Then Mateo took the box back. The following Monday, every driver, guard assistant, interpreter, and household employee received a formal event allowance. Odette, who ran the house, cried over a pair of orthopedic shoes she had been postponing for 3 years and hugged him, and Mateo endured it the way a man endures a tornado, warning one stiff hand hovering 4 inches above her shoulder while he looked at Iris for rescue. Iris signed that he had solved it and could live with the consequences. He got a little easier after that. The staff stopped pretending not to see when he signed. Meetings slowed down because Iris refused to let anyone talk over his written answers. He started using ASL more often, first with her, then with Gus, who knew enough to follow orders, but had never once had a conversation in it. And at night after the last car left, Mateo put the black pad away entirely and spoke only with his hands and told her once that writing was for men who required evidence and signing was for the truth. She should have protected herself from a sentence like that. Instead, she started looking forward to the hours after everyone else went home. He told her he hated pairs, that he distrusted men who polished their shoes too carefully, that he had once fired an attorney for interrupting a janitor. She told him Micah could name every span type on every bridge in Michigan, hated socks with seams, and would argue about suspension, cable tension for an hour, but could not remember where he had left his coat. He signed that he would like to meet him, then immediately added only if she and Micah both wanted that. She asked why. He signed that she talked about the boy as if he were the center of every room, even when other people refused to see him. That answer landed somewhere she had spent 8 years defending the part of her that flinched at praise disguised as pity. She said Sunday. No photographers, no formal dining room, and nobody touched Micah without warning. He agreed. Then he signed that the boy might want to inspect the smoke detectors and Gus would finally feel appreciated. Micah arrived carrying a cardboard model of the Ambassador Bridge with one span crushed inward from the car ride and immediately hated everything. The house was too big. Odette moved too fast. Gus's suit frightened him. The echo in the entry made his shoulders climb toward his ears and his hands stop moving entirely, which was how Iris always knew he had gone past the edge. Mateo did not approach him. He sat down on the library floor near the windows, took a roll of clear tape out of a drawer, and started repairing the bridge. Micah watched from the doorway for 4 full minutes. Mateo signed without looking at him that the structure had suffered a catastrophic failure. Micah's hands answered from the doorway that it was a suspension span, not a structure. Mateo considered that and signed that in that case it had suffered a catastrophic suspension. Micah came closer and signed that he was using far too much tape. Mateo signed that he was powerful, not skilled. Micah sat down and took over. For 50 minutes they argued about cable tension and deck load and whether a bridge with a broken span was still a bridge. Mateo never once praised the boy for signing. He never simplified a question. He waited through the long pauses without filling them, which Iris had watched approximately 4 adults in 8 years manage to do. And when the sound of silverware in the next room made Micah cover his ears, Mateo had lunch moved and the service carts removed and ate cold food an hour later, rather than let the kid feel like he'd broken something. On the drive home, Micah typed one sentence into his tablet and turned it toward her. The quiet man listens better than loud people. Iris photographed it and sent it. Mateo's reply came 10 minutes later. Tell him the feeling is mutual. She read it 3 times at a red light and understood with a kind of dread that she was smiling like a woman in trouble. By the end of the 30 days, the job had stopped feeling temporary, and so had the way he waited to drink his coffee until she came in, and the way she had started leaving the chair beside his empty at every meeting without deciding to. He walked her out at night and stopped at the path every single time, never once treating the dark as permission. The night the power went out, she found him lighting candles one-handed with the other pressed to his temple and asked if it was a migraine, and he nodded. And when she asked about medication, he simply didn't answer, which was an answer. She got close enough to touch the scar and stopped an inch away. He opened his eyes. Neither of them moved. Then he caught her wrist, not to stop her, but to guide her palm flat against the side of his face. He signed with his free hand that no woman had touched that scar since the hospital. She asked why her. His thumb settled over the pulse in her wrist, and he signed that she touched what hurt without looking at him like something broken. She traced the edge of it, and he closed his eyes, and the expression that crossed his face was not pain, it was relief, so deep it looked almost like grief. She signed that the world saw his silence, that she saw everything he was saying. He brought her hand down and did not let go, and signed that this was exactly why she was dangerous. She asked to whom. He signed to me. Then he leaned forward until his forehead rested against hers and stopped up there, leaving her every inch of room she needed to walk away. She closed it herself. Her fingers curled into the front of his shirt, and his control broke on one sharp breath, and he still asked permission with his hands before he kissed her. She said yes out loud because she wanted him to have both. The cane hit the carpet, his hands found her waist and stayed there until she moved closer, and she had expected a feared man to kiss like a conquest, and instead he kissed like someone who had been starved of being understood. When they separated, his hands shook once before they formed the words, "Only you make silence feel full." Camille Ashford Vane noticed within a week. She was a widow in her early 40s with 3 generations of museum board seats behind her polished, enough to make cruelty look like etiquette, and the society pages had been pairing her name with Mateo's since long before Iris ever walked into that auction hall. He had never encouraged it. Camille had built an entire future out of other people's assumptions anyway. She came to the house one afternoon with a foundation folder and told Iris to inform Mateo that Friday's dinner had moved to 8. He was standing 4 feet behind her. Iris told her he was right there and that she could look at him when she spoke. Camille's smile did not change the temperature so much as harden, and she turned and repeated it. Mateo signed thank you and that he would not attend. Camille looked at Iris and asked what he had said. Iris said he had declined. Camille said he had clearly said more than that. Iris told her that perhaps she should learn the language. And Mateo's eyes warmed just slightly, just for a second, and Camille saw it happen. From that afternoon on, she stopped treating Iris as harmless. She began appearing at meetings that didn't require her. She asked the Foundation's publicity office for access to the archived media library, saying she was assembling a retrospective on the family's cultural work. She questioned 2 photographers about private event footage. Iris noticed all of it, filed it under vanity, and thought nothing more. Mateo never hid her. When his Aunt Livia referred to her at a family dinner as the auction acquisition, he set down his fork and wrote one sentence that Iris read aloud herself, that Iris Marlowe had never been acquired, that a criminal claim bearing her name had been removed, and that if anyone at the table could not understand the difference, dinner was over. Livia's face went to stone. He didn't care. At the Kestrel Museum, Benefit, the coordinator, directed Iris toward the service entrance, and then Flushing discovered a seating area, Mateo at the front, beneath the Foundation banner, Iris at table 31, beside the service corridor, with the drivers, 2 elderly volunteers, and a debt. Camille appeared behind them in silver and suggested the organizers had assumed Iris would be more comfortable with the other staff and that it was only a chair. Iris told her that in that case she wouldn't mind taking it. Then Dunmore, thinner, twitchier, Bannon from 3 auction houses by then, and clinging to the last of his accreditation, said loudly near the champagne that people were confused about whether Miss Marlowe was attending as staff or as something more private, given the extraordinary sum Mr. Ruska had paid for her services. Somebody whispered a word. Iris heard it. Mateo went completely still, and she watched the entire room register that stillness and start calculating exits. And she realized she did not want to be a woman who survived a room only because the man beside her frightened it into silence. She said she would sit at table 31, and she walked away before her eyes could betray her. Odette squeezed her hand under the table and told her that rich people often confused what they inherited with what they earned. Then the cane started tapping across the ballroom. Conversation died in waves as Mateo crossed the floor, stopped at the empty chair beside her, and wrote 5 words on his pad. "May I sit here, Miss Marlowe?" Iris's throat closed. She said yes. The museum director hurried over and said his place was at the patrons' table. Mateo wrote that his place was where his guest had been seated. The director offered very fast, "To move, Miss Marlowe." Mateo wrote, "Move the patrons' table." Within 10 minutes, donors and board members and 2 city councilmen who needed his money were dragging chairs toward the service corridor, and the drivers and assistants who had been treated as background all night were being served first, and Camille and Livia sat alone at the front until pride marched them down to join everyone else. A reporter caught them near the stage and asked whether Miss Marlowe was more than an employee. Mateo looked at Iris first, asking, not telling, and only when she nodded did he sign directly toward the cameras that she was the woman he was courting. She translated it with a voice that nearly failed her. The reporter, smiling, asked whether he had really paid $1 million for her. His expression went arctic. He signed that he had paid off a criminal debt to remove a threat and that Iris Marlowe's choice had never been for sale. Cameras flashed. Camille stood 10 feet away with her face perfectly composed, except for the white pressure around her mouth, and she did not look at Mateo at all. She looked at Iris for a long, quiet moment, the way a person looks at a problem she has just finished solving. Iris didn't sleep that night, and not because of the cameras. She kept coming back to the way Camille had looked at her, not with jealousy, which she could have understood, but with something closer to bookkeeping. She told herself she was being paranoid, and for 11 days she was right because nothing happened at all. What happened instead was that the letter came. The Thornbury Institute in Providence had reviewed her application for the Rose Window Fellowship, a 16th century wheel damaged by water smoke, and a catastrophic 1950s restoration, and she had reached final selection. Furnished family housing, a stipend, permission for one dependent child and one caregiver to live on site for the duration of the project. She read it 4 times standing in the hallway and then had to sit down on the stairs because it was the first time in her adult life that a door had opened for her without a man's name attached to it. Mateo read it twice and signed that she should accept if they chose her. She said the project could run a year. He signed that then he would spend a year being proud of her and being with her, and that distance was geography, not surrender. She loved him a little more for that and hated herself slightly for how much it mattered that he hadn't flinched. She delayed her answer anyway. She told herself it was logistics. It wasn't. It was that his headaches had stopped behaving like headaches. He'd started losing the thread of his own sentences. Twice she watched his right hand stop halfway through a word and just hang there while his eyes moved as if the room had shifted under him. When she asked, he signed one word double. Gus called the doctor. Mateo refused to leave until the meeting finished, and Iris stood in the hallway afterward, with her heart going sideways, arguing with a man who could outstubborn a wall in complete silence. 2 days later at a museum board lunch, his pen fell out of his hand, and he reached for the edge of the table and missed it. Iris was across the room before anyone else understood what they were looking at. She got in front of him and told him to look at her, and his pupils did not track together, and then his knees went. She caught his shoulders. Gus got there in time to take the weight. Somebody's water glass shattered. 25 people stood up at once, and not one of them was useful. And Iris was on the floor holding the head of the most feared man in Detroit and telling him he was fine in a voice that sounded even to her like a lie. The ambulance took 6 minutes. It felt like 40. The angiogram found an irregular aneurysm on a cerebral artery near the right side of his brain. The neurosurgeon explained that the shape and the neck of it made open microsurgical clipping, the safer option that it had not ruptured, and that the new neurological symptoms meant waiting carried unacceptable risk. Surgery that night. Everything after that moved too fast for fear to organize itself into anything useful. Consent forms. A nurse shaving a narrow strip near his right temple. Gus calling Livia. Odette praying in the corridor with her fists against her mouth. Mateo stayed controlled the entire time right up until the orderly came for him. Then he caught Iris's hand and his fingers were cold, and he signed very slowly that when he woke up, hers was the first face he wanted to see. She pressed his hand flat against her cheek and told him to wake up then. His mouth moved around the shape of her name with no sound in it at all, and the doors swung shut between them. The operation took just under 6 hours. Iris did not sit down for the first 2. She stood at the end of the corridor with her arms wrapped around herself, and she made every bargain a person makes in a hospital hallway. And somewhere around hour 3, she started shaking so badly that Odette put a coat over her shoulders. When the surgeon finally came out, his cap was still on, and the lines around his eyes had deepened. He said the clip was secure. No rupture. Stable. Neuro ICU overnight for monitoring, and he would likely be confused, nauseated, slow, and poorly coordinated as the anesthesia came off. One visitor a few minutes once the nurses finished their assessment. Iris had to sit down on the floor. Gus closed his eyes. Odette started crying into both hands. 10 minutes later, Livia arrived with Camille. Iris had not called either of them. Livia had been Mateo's emergency contact on every hospital form since his mother died, and the staff treated that authority as automatic, the way hospital staff always do. Camille had come in a plain dark coat with no makeup, which Iris registered, dimly as strange and only understood much later. It was a costume selected for fluorescent light. Camille hugged Livia. She spoke gently to the surgeon. She did not look at Iris once, not until the nurse came out and announced that the approved family visitor could go in. Iris stood up and said she was going. Livia said the hospital had her name on the authorization. Iris said Matteo had asked for her. Livia said Matteo was not currently in a position to update legal forms. Gus stepped between them before it could become a scene and said that Miss Marlowe had been there since the ambulance. Livia's mouth thinned and she said that Miss Marlowe could continue waiting and that Camille had known him since childhood and understood the family's medical history. Iris said she understood him. Camille finally met her eyes then and there was something almost tender in her face, which made it infinitely worse. She said softly, "Let me go in first, I'll tell you how he is." Iris said she didn't need her to tell her how he was. Camille agreed that she didn't. And then she added that there might be things Iris needed to know before she stood beside his bed. Before Iris could ask what that meant, the nurse walked Camille through the secure doors. Iris turned to Gus and asked why she was here. He said Livia called her. She asked whether Camille had been requesting access to the Foundation's private media archives. Gus frowned and said yes, that she'd said the Foundation was preparing a family retrospective. He asked why. Riss said no reason and told herself she was inventing danger because fear had to go somewhere. Camille came back through the doors 20 minutes later, pale, dry-eyed, and told Livia that he had opened his eyes. Then she turned and asked Iris to speak privately. Iris said no. Camille said without raising her voice that she should see this before she went in. The hospital chapel at the end of the corridor had no camera in the corner by the candles. Camille closed the door and took a second phone out of her coat, not the polished one from meetings. This one had no case, no contacts on the screen, no notifications at all. She opened a photograph. Matteo on the museum balcony under the bronze lanterns Iris remembered from October. Camille's back against a stone rail, his hand cupping her face, his mouth on hers. Iris's body understood before her mind did. Her stomach clenched and her ears rang, and she heard herself say from a great distance that it wasn't real. Camille said to look at the date. It matched a reception Iris knew had happened. She swiped. Matteo and Camille in the backseat of a car, his fingers in her hair. She swiped again the library. His library. The same shelves where he had kissed her during the storm, and Camille's hand resting on the scar at his temple. Iris said these could be manufactured and heard how thin her own voice had gotten. Then she did the only smart thing she did that entire night. She opened the chapel door and called Gus down the hallway and asked him flatly whether Camille had been at the museum balcony reception on the 14th of October. He said yes, at Lake Geneva on the 3rd of March. Yes, at the Winter Foundation dinner. Yes, and then he asked her what this was. She looked at Camille, who was standing perfectly still, with her hands folded, and understood that every date on that phone was a date an honest man would confirm. She said nothing and shut the door again. Camille played a video. No sound there, never would be, because Matteo had no voice, and that was the whole architecture of it. Grainy, jumping, the kind of imperfect footage that reads as more genuine than any polished photograph. Him walking into a museum corridor. Camille following. A cut. The two of them pressed together in the dark, his coat, his shoulders, his scar. Iris asked why she was showing her this. Camille said because she had watched him turn Iris into the solution to a problem he had never explained. Iris said he had chosen her publicly. Camille said Matteo protected whatever fell under his authority, and that protecting a thing was not the same as loving it. Iris said she was lying. Camille said she wished she were, and then she softened her voice and delivered the line she had clearly been sharpening for weeks, that Iris had helped him communicate and calmed his headaches and made his house warm, and that he was grateful, and that Matteo confused gratitude with devotion when he was lonely. Iris gripped the back of the pew and said he had never touched her. Camille said Iris hadn't been there, that he told Iris what he could say with clean hands. Then she looked at her almost kindly and said that he had needed Iris's hands to speak, but when he wanted a woman, he came to her. It went in exactly where it was aimed, because Iris had spent her entire adult life being useful to people who did not choose her. Dunmore had valued her eye and signed her name. 3 employers before him had loved her work and paid her late. She had been the woman who fixed things quietly in every room she'd ever stood in, and here was a beautiful, expensive woman explaining gently that this was all she had ever been to him too. A nurse knocked and said Mr. Ruska was restless. Camille slid the phone back into her coat and said, "Come see for yourself." He was under white blankets with the right side of his head bandaged and monitors tracing lines Iris could not read. He looked smaller than she had ever seen him. Camille went in. His eyes came open part way. His right hand lifted a few inches off the sheet, and his gaze drifted toward the doorway, and Iris stepped closer to the glass and started to lift her own hands. Camille caught his hand and pressed the palm against her cheek. His fingers moved weakly against her face. From the corridor, it looked like a caress. Iris made the sign anyway. Their sign, the one neither of them had invented on purpose, 2 fingers near the heart, then out. She pressed her hands to the glass and asked him if it was true. His eyes shifted. They did not find her. Camille leaned in further and blocked the line of sight entirely, and by the time a nurse crossed between them to check a line, every image from that phone had settled over the living man like a second coat of paint, and Iris could no longer tell which layer was real. She didn't run. That was the part she held on to later. She didn't run. She stayed. She sat in the waiting room past midnight with her coat over her knees. She asked the resident when he would be able to communicate clearly and was told, possibly tomorrow, that tonight he was emerging from anesthesia and not to interpret confused movement as meaningful conversation. She wrote that sentence down on the back of a parking stub because she wanted to believe it. She opened every image on her own phone Camilo had sent them from an anonymous device, and then Iris would learn much later destroyed the handset, and she enlarged shadows until they dissolved into pixels, and she found nothing. Her exhausted eyes could prove false. At 3 in the morning, she called Rhea, who came in sweatpants under a coat with Micah asleep in the back seat. At the kitchen table, Rhea studied every photograph without a word and finally said they could be fake. Iris said she knew. Rhea asked whether she had asked him. Iris said he couldn't answer. Rhea said then wait until he can. Iris said she had seen his hand on that woman's face. Rhea said she had seen a man 40 minutes out of brain surgery, and Iris put her hand over her mouth because a sound was coming and Micah was asleep 12 feet away. She said the thing that had been eating her since the chapel. Not what if the pictures are real, but what if she stood beside his bed and he explained kindly that she was the woman who had helped him and Camille was the woman he had wanted. She said she did not want him to watch her survive that. Rhea came around the table and held her and said then she would survive it somewhere else. By dawn, the Thornberry offer was still sitting unanswered in her inbox with a noon deadline. Micah's school year had ended 2 days earlier. Rhea's restaurant had cut her shifts again. Every practical door in Iris's life had swung open at the exact hour her heart wanted to disappear, and she hated how convenient that was because it felt like cowardice wearing a good coat. Then she looked at the photographs one more time and remembered him signing that distance was geography, not surrender. She accepted the fellowship at 11:40, but she did one more thing first, and it was the thing that mattered. She went back to the hospital. She sat in the family lounge for an hour with a pen and hospital stationery, and she wrote it all down, what she had been shown, what she had seen through the glass, what Camille had said in the chapel, and where he could reach her, the legal office of the Thornberry Institute, in care of Dr. Junia Falk Providence. She sealed it. She wrote his name on the front in block letters. She walked it to the neuro ICU nurses station and asked them to give it to Mr. Ruska when he was alert, and a nurse promised she would, and Iris watched her place it in the file rack behind the counter. She left her key and staff badge with Gus in the corridor. He held them in his palm and asked why. She said she couldn't explain. He said then wait and explain it to Mateo. She said not today. He said Mateo had asked for her before they took him in. Iris's eyes burned and she said she knew. He said he would ask again. She said tell him she was alive. Gus asked where she was going and his face had gone hard with something that was not anger. It was fear on her behalf and it nearly undid her. He asked quietly whether Camille had said something to her, and Iris almost told him. She stood there with the whole thing on her tongue. Then she imagined the Ruska machine closing around an accusation she could not prove. Imagined the lawyers and the men, and the leverage imagined being brought back into that room to be gently corrected in front of everyone, and she said no. It was the first lie she ever told Gus Marek. He knew it while she was saying it. He let her go anyway, and she understood why only much later he'd assumed she'd leave a way to be found, because she had. She just didn't know that at 4:15 that morning before the shift change, Camille Ashford Vane had walked back to the neuro ICU with a family member's badge, and a soft voice said she was collecting Mr. Ruska's personal items for the family and taken a sealed envelope out of the file rack behind the counter. 36 hours later, Iris, Rhea, and Micah were on an eastbound train with no forwarding address. Iris disconnected her number and routed all professional contact through the Institute's legal office. She did not write him again because she believed she already had, and because she believed he had gotten it, and because when a week passed with no answer, the silence told her everything she thought she needed to know. Micah sat beside her with the bridge in his lap and signed halfway through Ohio whether they were coming back. She said she didn't know. He asked whether the quiet man was coming. She said no. His hands lowered into his lap and stayed there for a long minute. Then he lifted them again and asked whether the quiet man had stopped wanting them. And Iris, who had built her entire adult life on never lying to that child, opened her mouth and found she had nothing left that wasn't one. He woke fully the next afternoon and signed her name before he asked a single question about his own skull. Camille was standing at the foot of the bed when he did it. She told him Iris had waited outside, seen him through the glass, and left without explanation that perhaps the reality of his condition had frightened her. Mateo did not believe her for 1 second. He signed 3 separate times the same question, what did she see? Camille had no answer that fit, so she gave him grief instead, and grief is very hard to cross-examine. He sent Gus to the apartment before he could stand without help. The rooms were empty. The landlord said the tenant had paid through the month and left a forwarding request with no address on it. Iris's badge and key were sitting on his hospital tray when Gus came back, and Mateo looked at them until a nurse asked Gus to remove anything causing the patient distress. He refused pain medication for 3 days because it blurred his hands. The letter never reached him. He asked the ward twice whether anything had been left for him. The night nurse who had promised to hold it had gone off rotation for 4 days, and by the time she came back and glanced at the empty slot in the file rack, she assumed he had received it because the family had collected his belongings. That single administrative shrug cost 2 people 10 months. Gus located the institute in under 48 hours, but the family housing and the conservation lab were protected by confidentiality clauses that existed precisely because that project attracted collectors, insurers, and thieves. He offered to get the address another way. He was very clear about how easy it would be. Mateo signed that if she had closed the door on him, breaking it would not bring her back. So he sent one sealed letter through counsel instead. 6 weeks later, it came back to Providence marked refused. Unopened and Gus watched a man who had survived a craniotomy sit down slowly and put both hands flat on the desk and not move for a long time. Iris had held that envelope for an hour before she returned it. The Institute's attorney had asked gently whether she really didn't want to know what it said. She had said she already knew what she'd hear. She was wrong. The letter contained one sentence that he did not know what had happened and that when she was ready, he would listen. She would learn that 10 months later, and it would hurt more than any accusation could have. Providence saved her because it did not care who she loved. Damage answered only patience. The rose window had been drowned, smoked, and then destroyed a second time in the 50s by a restorer who thought bright meant beautiful. Dr. Junia Falk put a magnifier in Iris's hands the first morning and told her not to try to make it lovely to find out what had survived. Iris took that instruction far more personally than it was meant. For 4 months, her whole world narrowed to swabs and solvent tests and the slow chemistry of removing somebody else's confident mistakes. She cried in a grocery aisle because they stocked the same terrible coffee. She woke reaching across a bed that had never had him in it. She caught herself signing to an empty kitchen more than once and stopped hard like a person catching herself talking to the dead. She kept the photographs in a locked folder and opened them whenever memory tried to make him innocent. Micah asked about him every week for the first 2 months, then stopped asking out loud and started leaving bridge drawings on the refrigerator with nobody in them. The doubt came in through a crack so small she almost missed it. She was cross-referencing museum archive photography for a completely unrelated Providence question when she pulled up the public gallery from the October balcony reception, and something in the corner of one image snagged her eye and would not let go. The bronze lantern behind Camille's shoulder. In every archive photograph from that season, the lower glass panel of that lantern was cracked. A diagonal fracture the museum hadn't repaired until spring. In the photograph on her phone, the panel was whole. Iris sat in a dark lab at 11 at night and enlarged that lantern until it dissolved into colored squares and told herself glass was her entire profession, and she was seeing what she wanted to see and did not sleep at all. She still didn't call. 10 months of certainty does not surrender to one lantern. What broke it open was the television. The restoration finished in February. They had left some of the losses visible. Falk's rule that restoration means making the truth legible without letting the wound become the only thing anyone sees, and the Institute scheduled a public unveiling. And the communications director asked whether Iris would appear in a televised segment since her solvent analysis had changed the entire treatment plan. Iris said yes, because she had spent too many years letting other people decide when her work deserved a name on it. Rhea fastened the moon earrings Micah had picked out for the Kestrel benefit a lifetime ago and asked if she was sure. Iris said they were hers and that he didn't own every memory she had. On camera, the interviewer asked what the hardest part of working on something so badly damaged had been. Iris had a technical answer prepared. What came out instead was the truth, learning not to trust the surface and still finding the courage to work underneath it. The segment aired live in Detroit. Gus told her later that Mateo had been alone in the study when her face came up on the screen, and that he stood so fast his cane went over and got close enough to the television that Odette thought he might touch it. That when she said the word surface, his hand came up and formed her name without him deciding to. That a glass went off the edge of the desk and shattered, and he never once looked away from her mouth. He did not call the museum director. He did not offer a donation. He did not request private access to anything. He bought an ordinary ticket to the public unveiling under Gus's name and stood in the back row like a stranger. Iris saw him before she started speaking, and her breath caught so hard that Falk touched her elbow and asked if she was all right. She said yes. She was not. He was thinner. The right side of his hair was shorter where the surgeon had opened his skull, and a pale line curved above his temple. And for one brutal second, the ICU came back whole, the bandage, the glass, Camille's cheek against his palm. He did not move toward her. He did not signal or interrupt or use his name to clear the room. He stood there for 40 minutes while she explained overpaint and ethical loss compensation to reporters and students and donors. And when a collector tried to credit Falk alone, Falk named every member of the team, and the room applauded. When they got to Iris, and Mateo's hand stayed still on the head of his cane while pride moved openly across his face. She hated that she could still read him. She hated more that he looked exactly like the man she had loved and nothing at all like the liar she'd spent 10 months burying. Micah spotted him during the reception and went completely still, and then looked at her and signed one question: "Can I say hello?" The answer inside her was no. He had taken enough, but the boy's relationship with him had existed outside her broken heart, and she had promised herself once in a hospital corridor that she would never make a child pay for adults. She signed that he could decide. Micah crossed the gallery, carrying the bridge, still held together with too much tape because he had refused for 10 months to remove Mateo's original repair. Mateo saw him coming and lowered himself onto one knee. It cost him. She saw it in the tightening around his eyes. Micah stopped 3 feet away and signed that he had taken too long. Mateo's face broke open and he signed that he had not known where they were. Micah signed that he was a mafia boss and his aunt had hidden badly, actually. Mateo signed that his aunt had hidden extremely well. Micah considered that, then asked whether he had stopped wanting them. Mateo shook his head so fast it clearly hurt him and signed never. Micah signed that Iris said he never called. Mateo looked past him and found her across the room and signed that she had closed every door. And Micah, with the ruthless simplicity of an 8-year-old, signed back, "Maybe you should ask why." Mateo nodded and signed that this was what he had come to do. Then he spent 10 minutes on the bridge on cable tension on whether the tape counted as a historical repair. Now, and handed the model back without slipping anything under the deck, and did not use the boy to get 1 inch closer to her. That restraint unsettled Iris more than any pressure could have. She found him waiting outside the conservation lab after the last guest left. Falk offered to stay. Iris said she'd be fine and left the door open, and he only came in after she stepped aside. He signed that she was alive. Something in her went hot, and she said he'd known that. He signed that he had known an institution had accepted her, that he had not known whether she was eating, sleeping safe, or whether Micah still argued about bridges. She said he could have found her. He signed that he could have broken the privacy she chose and that he had not. She said how noble, and he flinched and did not defend himself, which took the legs out from under her anger in a way that a fight never would have. Then he asked why she left, and it came out of his hands raw and fast and without any of his usual control. She took out her phone. She had kept the files through 2 device changes as though pain required documentation to stay legitimate. She laid the first image on the work table between them. His face emptied. She opened the second, the third, then the silent video. His hands did not move for a long moment. She told him to say they were fake. He looked up and signed that they were fake. She said not to give her a clean answer, just because she had finally put the dirty thing in front of him, and he did the only thing that could possibly have reached her. He signed that she had no reason to believe him and that he was not going to ask her to. Then he picked up the phone without touching the screen and studied the balcony frame and pointed to the bronze lantern behind Camille's shoulder. Iris's stomach dropped. He pulled up the museum's public archive from that same reception. The cracked lower panel, the same rail, the same coat, the same angle of his shoulder in a photograph where he was standing entirely alone, looking out over the courtyard. The background hadn't been faked. The background was real. Camille had been inserted into it. Iris made a sound she was not proud of and put both hands on the table to stay upright, because a lantern she had found by herself at 11 at night was one thing and this was another. And both of them together meant she had spent 10 months of her life inside somebody else's software. She said the car photograph. He signed that he had never been in that car with her. She asked how she was supposed to know that. His jaw tightened and he signed the truest sentence he had ever given her, that she wasn't. Not yet. Then he signed that she should take copies, hand them to independent people, choose the experts herself, and that he would supply the original event archives through counsel, but would have no say in who analyzed them, and that if they came back authentic, he went very still. He signed that he would sign any confession she asked for and never come near her again. Iris sent the files to Falk, not to Gus. Falk routed them to the Institute's digital imaging lab and to an external forensic firm used for authenticating art photography. It took 18 days. He stayed in Providence for all 18 and never once appeared at her door. He went to the museum twice as a regular visitor and stood in front of the rose window for nearly an hour. Once she found a paper cup of ginger tea on the public bench outside the Institute, with no note attached, and she threw it away and then cried in a stairwell because it had gone cold. The preliminary report landed on a Friday. Every file was manipulated, generative reconstruction around hair, hands, and reflections. The video assembled from real quarter footage of Matteo walking spliced with a separate clip of Camille entering 4 minutes later, the frames between them synthesized. The source material had come from the Ashford Vane Foundation's Media Archive account, downloaded during the exact weeks Camille had requested a family retrospective. Payment traced to an outside media consultant through a shell invoice labeled Accessibility Campaign Rendering. The consultant's project backup still held discarded versions, including 2 frames where Matteo's scar appeared on the wrong side of his face. And in the assistant's message thread buried in the middle of the file, there was a photograph of a sealed white envelope with his name on it in block capitals taken on a hospital counter with a 1-line instruction underneath: destroy this. Iris read that line 4 times before she understood what she was looking at. She had written to him. She had left him a way back. And a woman in a plain dark coat had walked into a neuro ICU at 4:15 in the morning and taken it out of the rack. Relief did not arrive clean. It came entangled with rage and shame and 10 months of grief that suddenly had nowhere to go because the man she had been grieving had been sitting in Detroit asking one question over and over into an empty room. She looked up. Matteo was standing across the lab with the report in his hand, and he was not looking triumphant. He looked like a man reading his own autopsy. She said out loud that she needed him to say something. His hands came up. He signed that he was sorry. She said he had done nothing. He signed that she had been destroyed by a lie built out of pieces of his own life, and that her pain did not get smaller because he happened to be innocent. Iris's eyes filled, and she said the thing she had been carrying since the train that she had left him after brain surgery. He signed that she had believed he had betrayed her. She said she should have waited, and he signed that she had tried to ask him through the glass. She stared at him. He signed that he hadn't seen it clearly, that he had seen her hands and couldn't focus, that he had thought she was telling him she was there. Then he swallowed an old reflex that had produced no sound in 19 years and signed that when he woke up again, she was gone. Iris covered her face with both hands and stood there in a room full of microscopes while 10 months rearranged themselves behind her eyes. Matteo moved once, then stopped himself 4 feet away. He did not ask to touch her. He waited the way he had learned to wait, and it was somehow worse than if he had crossed the room. She finally said that she had sent his letter back unopened. He signed that he knew. She said she'd thought it was going to be an explanation of why he'd cheated. And he signed what the letter had actually said, that he did not know what had happened, and that when she was ready, he would listen. Iris sat down on a lab stool because her legs stopped participating. One sentence, 11 words. She had held that envelope in her hand for a full hour and handed it back across a desk because she was afraid of being talked out of her own eyes. She said she wanted to know why Camille did it. He signed that Camille had believed removing her would return his life to the arrangement she preferred. Iris asked whether it had worked. He answered without a pause, it removed his life. The forensic firm recommended immediate legal action. The museum board opened an independent investigation the same week because foundation archives and foundation money had both been used. His attorneys could have buried Camille Ashford Vane under criminal complaints before the end of the business day, and Gus made it very clear that there were faster options available. Matteo asked Iris what she wanted, once. Not as a lesson, not with a performance of patience wrapped around it. One question, and then he shut up and let her answer. She said the truth in the same world where the lie had been told, and no private punishment. He signed one word, done. And then after a beat, he signed that Gus would be disappointed. The board scheduled the disclosure at the Kestrel Museum at the opening of a joint accessibility and conservation initiative that had been in the calendar for a year. Iris flew back to Detroit for it and understood on the plane exactly which ballroom they had chosen. The same one. The room where table 31 had been parked beside the service corridor. This time her name was on the printed program under Falk's and above no one's, and the restored rose window had traveled from Providence for a 3-month exhibition, and there were 3 certified interpreters on the museum's payroll, where a year earlier there had been none. Camille arrived in white as though a color could convert an accusation into innocence. Livia came in behind her, looking a decade older than she had at the benefit. Dunmore hovered near the back until security informed him his accreditation had been revoked 8 months earlier, and escorted him out with a hand on his elbow. And Iris watched a man who had once written her name 41 times get walked out of a room by a kid in a blazer and felt exactly nothing. Matteo came in alone. The room still went quiet around him, but fewer people stepped back, and Gus Odette, 2 board members, and a woman from the education office all greeted him directly in ASL, and Iris saw him register that and look for half a second like someone had put a hand on his back. The board chair read the independent report without any drama, which made it worse for Camille than shouting would have. Fabricated from authentic archive material, foundation funds, access logs, the consultant's discarded frames, suspension from every board position, referral to law enforcement and civil counsel. A reporter asked Camille whether she had intended to destroy Miss Marlowe's relationship. Camille lifted her chin and said she had intended to protect a man who was being isolated by an employee with unusual influence over him. The room made a sound. Another reporter said that she had manufactured images of herself kissing him and shown them to Iris while he was in a neuro ICU 11 hours out of brain surgery. And Camille's control finally slipped, and she said the thing she had actually believed the whole time, that Iris had never been suitable for him, and everyone in this city had known it. Iris repeated the word suitable. Every microphone in the room turned. She said Camille had mistaken his silence for an empty space where she could write whatever future she wanted, that she had mistaken Iris being broke for proof that she could be bought, that she had mistaken Iris's work for something a powerful man had handed her, and that she had mistaken love for a weakness she could use without consequences. Camille said that Iris had walked out on him without asking a single question. And Iris said she had asked, through the ICU glass, and that Camille had made absolutely certain he could not answer. Then she said the last part quietly because it did not need volume. She said that she had also written it down. Everything, where she was going, what she had been shown, how to reach her, and left it sealed at the nurse's station with his name on it. And that at 4:15 in the morning, Camilla had gone back and taken it. The room did not gasp. It went absolutely silent, which was much better. Camille turned toward Matteo, then the way she had turned toward him for 20 years, expecting a Ruska to protect the Ruska, name from a scandal. He stepped forward and signed, and Iris did not translate a single word of it. One of the museum's interpreters voiced him. He said Camille had created the images, that Iris's pain had not been created. It had been real and she had carried it alone because someone had understood exactly how deeply she trusted him and had used that as a tool. Then he looked at the cameras and said that Iris Marlowe had been valuable before she ever knew his name, that he had not created her talent, her courage, or her dignity, that he had simply been fortunate that when an entire room moved away from him, she had been the one person who moved closer. A reporter asked whether they were together again. He kept his eyes on Iris and said that was Iris's private choice. It was the strongest answer he could have given, and both of them knew it. Camille was removed from the foundation, charged with misuse of funds and offenses related to digital impersonation and sued by the Institute and by Iris personally. Livia resigned from the board after admitting on the record that family preference had walked Camille into an ICU ahead of the person Matteo had actually asked for. She apologized to Iris once without asking her to make the apology comfortable, and then she went and enrolled in an ASL course at a community college at 68 years old and told nobody, and Iris found out 4 months later from a receipt. Dunmore lost his remaining licenses when the Draeger contract and the 41 authentications became part of a criminal referral. He attempted an apology through an attorney. Iris declined the meeting. Some consequences should not be softened for the comfort of the person who caused them. None of that repaired anything between her and Matteo. The truth removed the lie. It did not return 10 months. She went back to Providence after the press conference. He did not ask her to stay. He walked her to the car, put his hand flat over his heart, and signed the same words he had given her before surgery, that when she was ready, he would be where she could see him. Trust came back through ordinary evidence, not speeches. 3 weeks later, he came to Micah's school exhibition after Rhea invited him without telling Iris. He sat in the last row and brought no security inside. When the boy's tablet froze in the middle of his presentation on cable stage spans, Matteo did not stand up, did not approach the stage, did not turn the moment into a demonstration of his own decency. He waited. Micah restarted it and finished. Afterward, he gave the kid a fresh roll of clear tape and signed for emergencies. Micah hugged him without asking Iris's permission first, and Matteo closed his eyes and held him carefully and did not look at her over the boy's shoulder to collect a single point for it. The second thing was a public lecture. Iris spoke for 40 minutes on overpaint and ethical loss compensation, and he sat between two retirees taking notes. He didn't donate to the program afterward, didn't correct the moderator, didn't arrange dinner. In the lobby, she asked him why he'd come. He signed that this mattered too, that she had understood half the chemistry and stayed anyway. She said he'd understood about a third. He signed that he had sat through entire business conferences where men understood less and spoke considerably more. She laughed before she could stop herself, and the sound changed his whole face, and she let him walk her to the train. The third thing was dinner in her tiny apartment with Rhea and Micah at a planetarium sleepover. He brought no flowers and no expensive wine and no men in the hallway. He brought bread from the bakery downstairs because Micah had once informed him that rich people's bread tasted suspicious. They ate slowly. The quiet between them did not require translation. She reached for the salt, and his hand met hers, and both of them stopped. And she saw the ICU cross his face. She saw the exact second it arrived. So she turned her hand over and put her palm under his, and his fingers closed carefully. She said she was still angry. He nodded. She said not exactly at him. He nodded again. She said that sometimes she looked at him and saw those photographs for half a second and hated herself for it. His face tightened, and he signed that he understood, because sometimes he woke up out of a dream where he opened his eyes after surgery and the doorway was empty. Her eyes stung, and she said she hadn't meant to punish him. He signed that she had been trying to survive something she believed he had done. She said that didn't give them the time back. And he signed no, just no. He did not offer her a sentence about suffering making people stronger. He let the loss stay a loss, and that honesty made room for something gentler than either of them had been able to reach for in a year. She said she had missed his terrible coffee. He signed that it had improved. She said she didn't believe him. He got up, went into her 9-foot kitchen, and proved conclusively that it had not. And she laughed until tears ran down her face while he watched her with a hope so careful it nearly broke her. She crossed the room and kissed him. No formal question that time. His hands paused at her waist until she pulled him closer, and the kiss had grief in it and anger, and every night they'd spent on opposite sides of somebody else's lie. When they separated, he put his forehead against hers and signed that only she made silence feel full. She told him not to use old lines on her. He signed that it had worked the first time. She said barely, and his shoulders shook in that laugh that made no sound at all. They did not pretend one kiss finished the repair. She stayed in Providence through the end of the fellowship. He split his time between Detroit and the coast without once framing the travel as a sacrifice she owed him for. They went to counseling together with an interpreter. Neither of them employed, and he learned that being falsely accused did not erase the impact of what she had believed, and she learned that trusting her own eyes did not require refusing all other evidence. Rhea stopped inspecting him like questionable produce and started insulting his coffee directly, which in that family was a legal adoption. 8 months after the truth came out, the underground auction hall beneath the Kestrel was converted into a center for accessible art and conservation. Paid apprenticeships for people who could not afford unpaid training. Free contract review for temporary arts workers. Quiet rooms captioning interpreters, communication devices, and a program for adults who had lost speech to illness or injury. Iris refused the order of the names on the sign. Mateo refused to remove hers. They compromised on calling it the Open Gallery, and privately he never stopped being annoyed about it. Odette ran the welcome desk twice a week. Gus trained the security staff to address non-speaking visitors directly and turned out to be unexpectedly good at it. Rhea became the family programs advisor. Micah declared himself director of bridges and had to be told that emergency tape was not museum safe. The Lancet panel from Lot 17 hung in the first gallery after months of treatment in a corrected provenance. It was not from the famous studio at all. It was the work of an overlooked woman glazier from that workshop whose maker's mark had survived inside a fold of original lead, came where nobody had thought to look. Iris had found her name under the thread of a scrap of packing newspaper that everybody else had considered garbage. A woman dismissed as secondary had been in that window the entire time. On opening night after the last guest left, Mateo stood in the exact spot where Dunmore had grabbed her arm. He tapped the silver cane against the marble once. She signed that it was dramatic. He signed that he had planned subtlety, and Gus had objected. She signed that Gus had never objected to drama in his life. He conceded the point, and then he held out a small black card. It was the same one, the address, the time, and the line about coming only if she chose to. He had kept it for 2 years. On the back, he had written a new sentence that the first time she came toward him, he'd had nothing to offer but danger and an explanation, and that tonight he was offering a life, but the choice was still entirely hers. The ring was an old Ruska diamond reset into a plain band with 2 small open hands engraved beneath the stone. He did not kneel until she looked at him and nodded. Then the most feared man in Detroit lowered himself onto one knee in the room where 200 people had once refused to stand within 10 feet of him. He signed that she should marry him, not because he had saved her, because she had never needed a man to manufacture her strength. Not because she spoke for him, because he had a voice whether or not anyone chose to hear it, but because ordinary days were better with her in them, and because he wanted every future he could still earn beside her. She put her hand in his and said yes out loud so he'd have both. Micah shrieked from behind a column before Mateo could get back up, and Rhea, Odette, Gus, Falk, and half the staff came out of hiding. Iris said he'd promised no audience. He signed that he had promised no cameras, and Gus, who had already raised his phone, saw the look on his face and slowly put it away. They married 4 months later behind the open gallery, fewer than 60 people, no security, theater, no business alliance writing on the vows, no society photographer permitted to turn the day into proof of anything. Micah walked her down in a navy suit he hated and sneakers he refused to replace, with one small cardboard bridge span pinned inside his jacket for courage. Mateo carried no cane that day. He had worked with a therapist for 8 months after the surgery, not because he was ashamed of needing it, but because he wanted the choice. Halfway through his vows, the interpreter's voice broke and Micah stepped forward and finished them. And nobody in that courtyard had a dry face after that, including Gus, who blamed allergies in a building with no plants in it. 6 months after the wedding, a teacher asked Micah to draw his family. He put Matteo next to Ria and Iris and wrote the word father underneath in small letters. He didn't show anybody. Odette found it in his backpack and screamed so loudly the whole kitchen came running. Matteo looked at that word for a long time before he signed one question to the boy. Is this what you want? Micah rolled his eyes and signed that he asked too many serious questions and then hugged him. No auction, no $1 million. No headline had ever made that man look as rich as he did, holding an 8-year-old in a kitchen while a housekeeper wept into a dish towel. Irie became a senior conservator and later built a program for the women. The field had erased technicians, assistants, widows returning to work, caregivers who had shelved their training, women whose findings had spent decades filed under someone else's name. Visitors at the open gallery often asked whether damaged things could ever go back to exactly what they had been. She always said no. Restoration does not reverse time and does not pretend the loss never happened. It lets the truth keep standing without hiding where the repair had to be made. On their first anniversary, he took her down to the old hall after closing. Table 31's place card was framed on the wall beside the center's first annual report. She asked whether he regretted the $1.2 million. He signed that he regretted that the world had built a price around her safety. He did not regret ending it. She said that was a very Mafia answer. He signed that he could provide accounting details. She said never and took his hand. 200 people had backed away from Matteo Rusca because they had decided that silence meant danger, or emptiness, or something less than a whole man. One broke, exhausted, underpaid woman with a repaired shoe walked into that empty circle and said hello, and everything either of them ever became afterwards started in those 4 seconds. She was never bought, never rescued, and never anyone's property. She chose him. Twice. And the second time she chose him with her eyes wide open.